Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's event, What's Next for the International Response to Venezuela. I am Diego Area, Deputy Director of the Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. I would like to take this opportunity to extend a very warm welcome to all our attendees and speakers virtually and joining in person at our headquarters here in Washington, D.C. It's great to see so many familiar faces that I'm sure are going to be part of the future of the reconstruction of Venezuela. We're grateful to be hosting this event in partnership with Chatham House and the Inter-American Dialogue, two organizations that share our commitments to elevating the importance for domestic and international stakeholders to continue advocating a democratic solution for Venezuela. Today's discussion will address several pressing questions, such as how can the U.S. and regional governments work together to coordinate actions on Venezuela policy and to foster a unified understanding on how to approach the current situation. How can international and regional stakeholders support Venezuelan civil society in maintaining and advancing their efforts for transparency, legitimacy, and democracy? And most importantly, what can we expect from Venezuela going forward in terms of ongoing negotiations in Mexico and tensions surrounding the upcoming primary elections of the opposition? To frame these questions within the current political context in the U.S. and Venezuela, we are honored to have with us Francisco Palmieri, Chargé d'Affaires ad interim of the U.S. Embassy in Colombia and the Chief of Mission of the Venezuelan Affairs Unit. Our own Senior Fellow, Jeff Ramsey, will provide us with an overview of the current situation and set up the floor for Chief of Mission Palmieri. Thank you to our speakers for joining us today and look forward to a discussion. It is my pleasure to turn it over to Senior Fellow for Colombia and Venezuela, Jeff Ramsey, who will lay out the current context in Venezuela and what questions persist for the U.S. and regional leaders committed to advancing democratic solution to the country. Geoffrey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Diego. Good afternoon, and thank you all for being with us here today. I'm really excited for what promises to be an engaging conversation on the future of the international response to the crisis in Venezuela. As you know, a combination of economic mismanagement, deepening authoritarianism, and systemic human rights violations have led, according to the latest UN numbers, 7.7 million Venezuelans to flee the country. Venezuela today is home to one of the worst humanitarian emergencies in the hemisphere. The UN estimates that 1 in 3 Venezuelans does not get enough to eat. So in this context, it's more urgent than ever for the international community to facilitate a peaceful, democratic solution to the crisis in Venezuela, led by Venezuelans themselves. The way forward is not going to be easy. Recent developments have shown that the search for a negotiated solution is going to be an uphill battle. There's a number of open questions that will have to be resolved, and hopefully the next few weeks will bring clarity on some of these. These include what will happen with negotiations. Since August 2021, the opposition Unitary Platform Coalition has been in talks with the Maduro government. In November of last year, these talks resulted in a historic agreement to use sanctioned funds to address Venezuela's humanitarian emergency. But since then, the agreement has stalled, and the United Nations has still not created the trust fund that would channel sanctioned money. And the future of these negotiations is unclear. The humanitarian agreement was supposed to be the low-hanging fruit in this process. It was supposed to be the mango bajito that would build momentum towards more substantial political agreements. The fact that that hasn't happened 10 months later raises questions about the future of international efforts to advance negotiations in Venezuela. Next, will we see further closure of civic space? A crackdown on civil society continues apace. Human rights groups in the country continue to denounce incidents of repression. And the Venezuelan human rights organization Foro Penal has found that as of today, there are 281 political prisoners in the country, the majority of which are still awaiting trial. The opposition is moving forward with the primary election to choose a presidential candidate in next year's vote, but the government has effectively blocked online access so that interested Venezuelans can't see where they can go to vote in that process. Meanwhile, 3 of the main opposition figures have been banned from holding political office. Candidates Maria Corina Machado, Enrique Capriles, and Freddy Superlano are all currently disqualified. If one of them wins the primary on October 22nd, it's far from clear that they'll be actively allowed to run. Moving forward, the international community is going to need to speak in one voice in ensuring that 2024's elections are credible and competitive, and not a rigged process that allows Maduro a fig leaf of legitimacy. Finally, how can the international community better coordinate to promote a peaceful, democratic solution? That's the question that brings us all here today. And this is where we at the Atlantic Council believe that we can actually make a difference. We're committed to keeping Venezuela on the radar of the international community and to pushing for pragmatic solutions that benefit the Venezuelan people. Last month, for instance, we published a comprehensive report looking at the status of the humanitarian agreement. Copies of it are available outside for those of you that missed it. We also want to find ways to encourage greater coordination. I should say that we're very glad that Colombian Ambassador Luis Gilberto Murillo has offered to give some remarks at the close of our event today, given Colombia's role in responding to the crisis and hosting a key international conference on Venezuela in April. At the Council, our Venezuela Working Group, formed in 2021, has been a key group of experts and policymakers helping to shape the international response. Moving forward, I'm excited to announce that we are reshaping this Venezuela Working Group. In the coming months, we will be adding several new high-profile members to encourage a greater focus on how Latin American governments can exhibit greater leadership in responding to the crisis in Venezuela. So watch this space. We also seek to ensure that conversations around geopolitical and energy concerns are linked with and not in parallel to efforts to advance a democratic solution. We know that a Venezuelan-led solution to the crisis is going to involve a wide array of stakeholders, from the private sector to civil society to the international community. And for all the above reasons, we were so excited to partner with Chatham House and the Inter-American Dialogue for this event today. We're hoping to generate new and innovative thinking in ways to address the crisis in Venezuela from the international community. And in order to set the stage for the conversation today, we really couldn't envision a better speaker than Francisco Paco Palmieri, Chief of Mission. Since assuming his role as Chief of Mission for Venezuela earlier this year, Palmieri has exhibited tireless leadership on this issue. Building on his status as Chargé d'Affaires in Colombia, as well as his 36-year diplomatic career, he has brought a wealth of experience to efforts to empower Venezuelans to shape their own future. And he's played a key role in coordinating with international actors to push for a peaceful democratic solution in Venezuela. Chief of Mission Palmieri, we know that the United States and Venezuela share a long history, and we are honored that you can be with us here today to share some insights into the future of U.S. policy, and as we all hope for a swift return to democratic order. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jeff and Diego, your Atlantic Council, Chatham House, and Inter-American Dialogue colleagues for convening this important discussion today. And for so many of my friends who are in the audience, it's good to see you all. My hope is that events like this one can help refocus international attention on Venezuela at a pivotal moment in Venezuela's democracy. Venezuela's political, economic, and humanitarian crisis has persisted far too long. There is a way out of this crisis if Nicolas Maduro is willing to seize it. As Assistant Secretary Nichols, Principal Deputy National Security Advisor Feiner, and many others have stated, if we see Maduro take concrete actions towards restoring democracy in Venezuela, including by creating conditions for free and fair elections in 2024, the United States is prepared to offer relief by reducing and relaxing sanctions. We in the U.S. government have not set an explicit deadline by which such actions must be taken. But obviously, the coming weeks ahead are critical. If Maduro is serious about holding free and fair elections in 2024, certain steps must happen now. For example, setting a firm election date, allowing all democratic actors to participate, conducting a thorough update of Venezuela's electoral registry, and laying the groundwork for a credible international election observation mission in 2024. The United States has been unequivocal about the necessity of election observers. We urge Maduro and his inner circle to authorize one or more credible international electoral observation missions without delay. Whether a mission is headed by the European Union or another competent authority, it is essential that it have total access to the electoral process, complete freedom of mobility within Venezuela, and the ability to speak freely to the press at any time in accordance with international standards. In addition, we have consistently underscored that creating conditions for free and fair elections in 2024 entails actions such as releasing political prisoners and opening space for local and international media to operate freely and independently, among other measures. The question of candidate disqualifications will also be paramount. One of the characteristics of free and fair elections is that they allow for broad participation by voters, candidates, and political parties. It is hard to envision how any election can be free and fair when leading candidates are banned. For that reason, we will continue to insist that all such bans be lifted and that all candidates can pursue their candidacies in a transparent manner. We in the international community believe that in a free and fair election, those in power cannot handpick their opponents. In recent weeks, I've often been asked if a breakthrough in the negotiations process is imminent. My answer is that a breakthrough remains possible if Maduro and those who surround him negotiate with Venezuela's democratic opposition in good faith, agree to specific, concrete actions, and then follow through on those commitments. I am encouraged by reports of productive conversations in Caracas between Maduro and unitary platform representatives about returning to negotiations. If these conversations result in a formal return to the Mexico City process facilitated by Norway, this would be a very positive step. At the same time, even as we urge both sides to pursue a path that leads back to Mexico City, those of us who care about Venezuela's future should be wary of any effort to promote separate negotiations that aim solely to divide Venezuela's democratic opposition. The October Democratic opposition primary is vitally important in that it allows Venezuelans to exercise their rights to make their voices heard peacefully and democratically. In addition, it provides opposition candidates with an opportunity to present their visions for a more democratic and prosperous Venezuela that respects fundamental rights and acts responsibly on the international stage. Our hope is that the primary, though it is a competitive process by nature, will result in even greater unity of purpose among all those who seek a better future for Venezuela. The United States is focused on ensuring the October primary proceeds unimpeded and creating the conditions for a free and fair presidential election in 2024. Interference in or obstruction of the primary process is counterproductive. Venezuelans who are interested in participating in the October 22nd primary deserve the chance to do so safely and peacefully. It can be the building block for a free and fair presidential election in 2024. Now, the international community also has a role to play in addressing Venezuela's long-standing problems. These challenges include the matter of Venezuelan debts and assets abroad, humanitarian support for vulnerable Venezuelans, and the issue of transnational criminal groups operating within Venezuela. International support will be needed on all of these issues and more. The role of Latin American governments will be key. Those of us who want to see a more democratic Venezuela need to stand firm and speak with one voice. We must make international acceptance and increased trade depend on Maduro's willingness to implement democratic reforms now. I would like to commend the Colombian government for the very helpful role it played in April by focusing the discussion on the need for Maduro to establish a clear timeline for free and fair elections in 2024. Implement the recommendations of the 2021 EU Electoral Observation Mission report and accelerate the implementation of a UN-administered humanitarian fund. We are in discussions with like-minded partner countries and other friends of Venezuela to unite the international community in support of democracy, economic and social development, and human rights for the people of Venezuela. When Venezuela's neighbors in the region, many of which have their own stories to tell of successful transitions from autocracy to democracy, speak loudly and boldly about the steps needed to put Venezuela on a more democratic path, the Venezuelan people take notice and take heart. So thank you again for convening what I know will be a productive conversation. Just as I am inspired by the many Venezuelans who continue to strive for greater democracy and prosperity in Venezuela, despite the countless obstacles in their way, I'm glad to see that so many of you in the region and beyond remain committed to accompanying the Venezuelan people on their long and difficult journey forward. Thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Chief of Mission Palmieri. Now we turn to our panel. Again, we are absolutely delighted to be co-organizing this event along with the Chatham House and Inter-American Dialogue. And to moderate this expert panel, we have with us Dr. Chris Sabatini, who is Senior Fellow for Latin America at Chatham House and was formerly a lecturer in discipline in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Chris is also on the advisory board of the Committee for Human Rights Watch's Americas Division and of the Inter-American Foundation. He's also an HFX Fellow at the Halifax International Security Forum, as well as a Senior Professor of Practice at the London School of Economics. He's a frequent contributor to policy journals and newspapers and appears in the media on panels and issues related to Latin American foreign policy. He's testified before Congress multiple times, and he's a leading thinker on all things Venezuela. Thanks so much, Chris.
Not sure about that, but thank you, Jeff. That's very, very nice. In May 2020, at the initiative of this woman here to my right, my friend Tamara Terra-Sig-Bronner, we convened in Chatham House a meeting of leading diplomats from Europe, the US, elsewhere, democracy activists, politicians, scholars, because at the time, it had been 3 years since the policy, 3 years plus, since the policy of maximum pressure started by the Trump administration had been launched, that it failed to bring any change. Certainly the Maduro government had failed to collapse. despite the maximum pressure strategy. In fact, it seemed quite strong at the time, despite that maximum pressure strategy. Negotiations had stalled. Human rights abuses continued, indeed perhaps even worsened, and there was a humanitarian crisis, which had started before the maximum pressure situation, but it obviously increased over time. The idea at the time was, how can we begin to build more international attention around Venezuela? How can we begin to push in a more concrete and constructive way for change? And how can we represent, in this room, but also more broadly, the plurality of voices around Venezuela, in Venezuela, younger political leaders, younger business leaders, younger civic activists, community leaders, and humanitarian activists, to try to increase and expand the dialogue and the voices internationally around Venezuela? Well, this is part of that effort, and I want to thank the Atlantic Council for hosting us, and I want to thank Tamara Tarasuk. At the time, she was at Human Rights Watch. Now she wears a different hat at the Inter-American Dialogue, and I hope this begins to push forward that agenda. Because what's happened is even in the last couple months, we've seen the possibility of elections, or free and fair elections, deteriorate. We've seen the Maduro government go to China and seek about 10 different agreements. Human rights conditions have not improved. But let's be honest here. To quote the great Sam Cooke, change is going to come. The question is what change? The question is how. It may not happen through an election of sort of the type that we imagined, or perhaps was imagined before. There are a number of different ways we can fathom that that change could occur. Pacted change, process of some coalition government. It may not be as clean as we desire, but it does mean, however change happens, there need to be a set of conditions that facilitate that and strengthen and make the country more governable. The question then is sort of what are the incentives that the international community and others can help promote to ensure that change? What is the balance between human rights accountability and reconciliation? What are the electoral conditions that may help foster that? And what are the economic conditions that may foster that? There can't be free and fair elections if there are human rights abuses, systemic human rights abuses, restrictions on freedom of expression, restrictions on accountability, restrictions on the ability to organize. There can't be free and fair elections when major candidates, the three that Paco mentioned, are disqualified. And there can't be democracy if there's not a private sector. In our first meeting in May 2022, a diplomat, it was under the Chatham House rule, so I can't say, of course, who it was. We exist in the Chatham House rule. We just call it the rule. It's like Mexican food in Mexico. It's just food. It's the rule. But in that moment, one of the diplomats looked at us and said about sanctions is the opposition has to start worrying about what country it's going to inherit. Will it inherit a completely economically devastated country in a failed state? And it's time we start worrying about that. So today, to join us, we're going to start to, I hope, broaden this discussion here on the panel, but also in the audience. You can't see them if you're online, but if you're in the audience, you can look around. We have a number of younger, diverse members of the Venezuelan community, civic activists, politicians, business leaders, that we hope to sort of start to broaden this debate and think more fully about how and what the international community can do to help promote peaceful change in Venezuela. So what I'm going to do is introduce all three panelists here. But I also want to say that if you want to ask questions, there'll be a question and answer period. Even if you're in the audience, you have to actually post them online. So you'll be basically at the level playing field as those who are virtual, except that you can't be watching in your pajamas here. Is you just write your questions in askac.org, and I'll call them up here. Okay, so Tamara Tarasuk, I mentioned you earlier, is now the director of the Peter Bell Rule of Law Program at the Inter-American Dialogue. She was previously the acting director and deputy director at America's Watch, and she writes often and powerfully about human rights abuses across the hemisphere and has been active in this for a very long time. Rodrigo Naranjo is a managing partner at VIP Capital. He's also on the board of Conapri. He will talk about what the private sector sees in Venezuela. And last but certainly not least is Bibi Beatriz Borges. She's the executive director of the Justice and Peace Center, CEPAS, a nonprofit organization that works on human rights and civic rights in Venezuela, and she's also a professor at a number of Venezuelan universities, but currently residing in Houston. Tamara, why don't you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on human rights and this balance between accountability and reconciliation?
Thank you, Chris. And thanks for the Atlantic Council for hosting this meeting and to Chatham House for this partnership. I'd like to share a few thoughts starting with there's obviously a feeling of normalization regarding the situation in Venezuela. It's due to the dollarization, due to the recognition that the Maduro government is receiving, due to the fact that the humanitarian and the human rights situation is not as visible as it was when it was in the cover of every newspaper in Latin America. But as Jeff mentioned, it is very far from normal. And what has led, this normalization has led to the fact that engagement is today the game in town with Venezuelan authorities. And that's not wrong. It's not necessarily wrong to talk to everyone. The question is how, and the question is for what? Are we engaging to generate those conditions for a transition, or are we allowing authorities to perpetuate themselves in power by gaining time through these ongoing conversations? The focus on the elections is very important and certainly something that we should all support. And there's a clear roadmap laid out by the European Union on what the conditions should be for those elections. I would say on that just that it's important to focus on the immediate future and on the primaries, which are happening very soon, on the fact that people are struggling to find food, medicines, oil, electricity. How can we ensure that those people can actually vote and exercise the right to vote? And I would encourage all of us to keep an eye out for potential repression, which has happened in the course of electoral cycles in Venezuela repeatedly. And I think another very important element there is what's the opposition's role going to be before, during, and after the primaries in terms of having a unified approach to the electoral cycle and what is going to happen in Venezuela. Now, the more difficult and interesting question, I think, is why would a very strong government in power today that is holding on to power be willing to allow this to happen? And the history has shown that Venezuelan authorities have not given concessions voluntarily. So the question is, how do we create incentives for that conversation to happen and to be able to open a door to a transition to democracy that is actually closing today? It's fine and important to think about a model for social and political coexistence after an election takes place, but it's very important and much more urgent to think about how do we create the conditions to open that door that is currently closing. So I think the main question that we need to answer today is how do we provide a golden bridge to some people in power to allow for this transition to take place? Elections are obviously a tool for that. You have this discussion about sanctions in exchange of electoral conditions. Clearly the humanitarian situation predates sanctions by the US government, but obviously overcompliance has been a problem. There are also targeted sanctions that can be used in these negotiations. And clearly sanctions should not be an end, but rather a means to obtain something. So to the extent they are being used, that is fantastic. And obviously it's important because free and fair elections is not only something that the opposition wants, but actually they would provide recognition, or the recognition that the Venezuelan government is actually looking for if they're carried out in a fairly decent way. So it's actually something that would benefit the government if they think they can get away with it. But I think we need to think beyond electoral conditions. So the question here is not just who needs to be held accountable and for which crimes the day after, but rather how much impunity can be offered and for which crimes to create those incentives. There are two types of crimes that have been committed in Venezuela over the past years. We have human rights crimes, grave human rights crimes, that are so serious that have led to the first investigation by the prosecutor's office at the International Criminal Court that may rise to the level of crimes against humanity, in which the Venezuelan judiciary has been complicit. And we have crimes related to corruption, organized crime, drug trafficking. Anti-corruption activists have tracked more than 200 ongoing investigations into crimes related to organized crime. These have taken place in 29 countries, many of them here in the United States, but there are also cases in Spain, in Argentina, in Colombia, in Brazil. They're linked to the oil industry, to the health sector, to the security sector, to the judiciary. In international law, there are clear guidelines regarding crimes against humanity. There are certain red lines you can't cross. There are no amnesties, no pardons for crimes against humanity, and that's a very clear bar. There are some gray areas related to chain of command responsibility, some discussion in terms of which crimes can be subject to amnesties, what sort of sanctions you can impose. So there is some level of conversation there. And there are models out there of other countries that have dealt with this situation. I'm going to wrap up soon. But the truth is that the solution has to be Venezuela-specific, led by Venezuelans, and it has to have the buy-in of human rights victims and their families. Now, the most interesting thing, and I leave that for the last minute, is what to do with corruption cases, right? Because you don't have those red lines there. And the question of, and it's interesting for two reasons. One, because impunity for the most serious crimes can't be guaranteed. That is going to haunt people involved and responsible for them forever, wherever they go. However, I think it's important to remember, and I think I can pretty confidently say that there are many more people involved in corruption in Venezuela, in power or linked to power, than those who are going to be prosecuted for crimes against humanity. So you have a critical mass there. And I think that, we need to ask ourselves, how can accountability help us get to this pacto de convivencia, where we want to get? And I want to pose three questions that I think we need to answer. First, who in government is willing to have this conversation? Who is implicated in corruption, but not in crimes against humanity, and wants to be remembered as someone who transitioned the country to democracy and not as someone who has been part of a repressive government? Second, what are the benefits that we can offer within the boundaries of the rule of law for this conversation to happen? And what are the requirements that they have to be able to have this conversation? Third, how can this agreement be upheld? What sort of guarantees can we offer in the medium and long term? And just two final thoughts, very quickly.
Very quickly. Very quickly. You've already...
First, let's remember how long it took Venezuela to get here. The debacle of Venezuelan democracy took many, many years. Getting out of this mess is going to take a long time. Someone said earlier, it's not going to be clean. I would venture to say it's going to be dirty. So let's figure out how to do that. And second, this requires a multilateral response. There's no way we can get around this with any sort of unilateral approach to the Venezuelan crisis. Thank you.
Bibi, you have a broad network of contacts on the ground in Venezuela. You've been working in Venezuela for many years. What are the human rights conditions right now in Venezuela? What are your thoughts?
Well, no, thank you for inviting me to this discussion. And I want to mention that my participation is not only for my work in CEPAS, but also is part of a collective reflections that we, with several human rights organizations, we have undertaken in a process that we call Ideas for Democracy. Because the time is short, and I will address three dimensions of the crisis very quickly in Venezuela. That is a really challenge.
It's complicated too.
Yes, but I want to focus on the humanitarian situation, the political persecution and violence, and the current strategy to restrict civil space. First, I think it's always good to remember that Venezuela has been living in, under an authoritarian model that has been the foundation of the complex humanitarian emergency and the human rights violations and the loss of the democratic institution is, and recover that is part of the solution of this crisis. In terms of the complex humanitarian emergency, we announced since 2015, still progressing and with clear dimensions and scope yet to be officially recognized. They're still not recognized of that crisis, and the assistance needs are underreported and underestimated in this emergency. According to UN Venezuela, that is a platform of NGOs in Venezuela that are monitoring the humanitarian situation, on August 2023, there are 90 million people in need in humanitarian assistance in Venezuela. And the most evident consequence of this emergency is the exodus of vulnerable Venezuelans who find little hope and dignity in the country. And according to the R4B, as on August this year, the number of migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees worldwide reaches 7.71 million Venezuela, making an increase of 319,000 people compared to May to this year. And this is a humanitarian situation. We can talk more about that, but it's still taking the suffering and life of people in Venezuela. Also, in the human rights violations and the political violence, serious human rights violations continue to occur in Venezuela without being investigated and without having an independent and impartial justice system that to deliver justice to that violation. Recently, the coalition Justice and Truth, we published a report that Venezuela has received around 118 recommendations for the United Nations regarding to justice and human rights, but the government has not taken effective measures to address this issue. And the justice system in Venezuela is weakened, is manipulated, and is denying justice for citizens. And the situation is not new. Has become a long-standing problem in the country, and the report calls to international human rights standards and to fulfill the recommendation that those report, and any negotiation or dialogue to resolve the crisis in Venezuela should emphasize this importance of transparency and justice in the country and how this affects victims of human rights. And also, the group in the power is facing international investigation for crimes against humanity, human rights violations, and also the undermining of the rule of law. And in this context, and I want to also add to Tamara the concern about the increase of political violence in electoral context. This is something that we have been documenting and is essential to raise awareness about this issue. In CEPAS, the political persecution monitor, the first half of the year, and then at least 385 cases of persecution and criminalization. That means that in Venezuela, every 12 hours, someone becomes a victim of human rights violation through acts of persecution. And in simple terms, from January to June, 2 people every day are felt victims of this persecution. And that sends a very powerful message to fear and to demobilize the population, and it's affecting political leaders, and it's part of the ongoing repression system that the government is currently investigating for. And I want to pass also for how this mechanism is applying to civil society right now. And if there is some hopeful in Venezuela, a civil society. It's vibrant, it's commitment, but after many years of persecution and repression, now is also very affected. And for many years have been treated by criminalization, by restrictive laws, to silencing the civil society. But thank you for the support and the work of civil society, but also for the support of international community statements. This hasn't happened, but we are concerned about new strategies to close the civil space in Venezuela. Something that is important is that the active effort to fragment civil society and making it voice that represents certain interests, and this strategy for those in power for aims to create division between radicals and interlocutors seeking divide civil society is something that we have to work on, and we need to fight together for democracy. I just want to finish that elections are a window of opportunity, and it's a moment for the right of participation. And I think it's a moment that we need to advocate for organization of democratic community. We need to advocate for coordinate pressure for international community. We need to advocate for continuation of the investigation for the international human rights bodies. We need to advocate also for economic improvement, but it's crucial that economic sector, that the best condition for doing business in Venezuela is democracy. And we have to advocate for authentic election and for a peaceful action to build peace in Venezuela. We cannot stop for demanding our rights and in a democracy, for democracy on authoritarian government. And we need that alert about the violence that is going to be very present in the next 2 years in the electoral context. Case like Yapama, and I finish, is an example. The violence against defenseless population, and it's unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you, Bibi. Rodrigo, the private sector, the view.
Well, the current status quo doesn't work clearly for the 30+ million Venezuelans, and it doesn't work for most Latin American countries. And I will say that it's not only a problem for some Latin American countries, but I think it's a long-term risk for them, for these Latin American countries, and for the United States too. And the reason is that the 7.7 million, and I'm taking your number, Venezuelan migrants, represent a potential major problem for the stability of the entire Western Hemisphere. Just think about Germany the last 10 years, how the Syrian migration to Germany alter the local political dynamics of Germany. Now think of much poorer countries in Latin America. When you bring 500,000 or 800,000 or 1 million migrants to these South American countries, that can alter completely the political balances. And as you see, you have seen the last few years from Chile to Ecuador to Peru and Colombia, the streets of Latin America can very quickly go from being peaceful to being violent. So that's a long-term problem that Venezuela went from exporting oil to exporting people, which means exporting problems. That clearly creates instability. It's not good for any country in the Western Hemisphere. For U.S. interests, that one strategic interest will be nearshoring. Well, if the region becomes more unstable, that's not a good idea. And having Venezuela not maximizing its oil and gas production capacity, it doesn't help European security either. Geopolitical interest, as Europe would like to diversify away from other more troublesome regions of the world. Now, if we're going to having said all this, if we're going to have a conversation about Venezuela and the future of Venezuela, I think the business sector, the Venezuelan business sector, and when I say Venezuelan business sector, I do not only mean Venezuelan companies. I also mean multinational companies operating in Venezuela. It should be at the center stage of the discussion. And it should be center stage for 3 reasons. The first one is because it's only the private sector, it's the only player that can generate the jobs that you will need in order to bring in eventually those 7.7 million people back to Venezuela. Right now, the first thing is stop the outflow of people, which it's continuing. First, you have to stop the outflow, and then you have to create the conditions for them to come back. For that, you need to generate millions of jobs, good-paying jobs, stable jobs, and only the private sector can do it. At the same time, only the private sector, and mainly international oil companies, are the ones that can increase production because they have the technical knowledge and they have the financial resources. And the third reason is that it's very simple. The business private sector is the backbone of civil society. Without business private sector, a stronger business private sector, you will not have stronger societies helping in education, in health, religious organizations, etc., etc. So what's the situation right now of the remaining of the business private sector? Because it had shrunk considerably given what we have gone through. Is that if you talk to businessmen in Venezuela from north to south, east and west of Venezuela, you hear 6 complaints. The first one is extremely low demand. Clearly, the economy shrunk by 80%. So right now you have overcapacity, and that means your cost of production are not competitive to compete with products coming from outside. Forget about exporting. The second one is over taxation. You have mayors and governors from the opposition, from parties that are squeezing every till the last cent of profits that the remaining businesses are still operating in Venezuela. The third one is over regulation and controls. Fortunately, there have been some positive changes in the last 3 years regarding that. The fourth will be the effects of over-compliance due to international sanctions. We can talk about a lot about that. Then there is lack of financing. If you add up all the loans of the Venezuelan banking system to Venezuelan companies, you don't get to $1 billion. In the past, it used to be between $40 and $50 billion. So if you don't have access to financing, it will be very, very difficult that you can grow your business and compete with products coming from other countries. And finally is poor access to electricity and gasoline. If you cannot turn on your plants and you cannot move your trucks, it's very hard. You can run the business and be competitive. So the final message, the final point here is there's a lot of things that clearly there are things here that have to be changed from inside Venezuela, but there are some more other things that affect these 6 considerations I mentioned you that affect the Venezuelan businesses, where foreign players can play a more proactive role. And the objective should be moving the private sector from being what is right now, which is a victim of collateral damage, is a collateral victim, to being a part of the solution, being an engine to solving the Venezuelan difficulties.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. Certainly, we often hear businesses talk about how it's important to get more Western-oriented businesses involved in Venezuela. They have better practices than, say, China or Russia. The truth is I think that with that responsibility of wanting to invest or that demand comes a certain responsibility of being more transparent and bound by the rule of law. So the question is, what sort of investment? And I think that's important. Private sector is important, but the question is, what private sector, with what responsibilities will it come and how will it be governed to promote the rule of law and the sort of institutional reforms? Now, we've got a lot of questions here, and we have very little time. So what I'm going to do is just read through all the questions. So take notes, and then I'll ask you all to answer them. It'll be kind of like speed dating, except without any of the potential rewards. Okay, first one is anonymous, is what's the prospect for real elections in 2024? The second one is, what's the role of the private sector in encouraging a more stable, democratic Venezuela? Sort of what I was just saying, actually. Another one from an anonymous, what is the role of international development organizations in this context? What sorts of projects could and should be designed and implemented to achieve meaningful change? Interesting point. Another one, what is Colombia's role in pushing for a democratic solution in Venezuela? How can other regional leaders work to support free and fair elections? That's why from Maria Elvira. Another one by George Hodge is, what is the impact of sanctions on civil society and on the humanitarian emergency? And last, by Andres Davila, is how can the interests of countries like China, Russia, and Iran hinder the democratic transition in Venezuela? So why don't we, actually we'll go in the order because you've had some time to think about them now, Tamara. Far away.
Thank you. I'm going to take
anyone else, please?
Just a couple of thoughts on a couple of these, and then I'll pass it because I think others are more directed to others on the panel. But so I think the question on Colombia's role is strictly tied to what I was trying to say at the end in my final thought about the need of a multilateral response. I think we need the region to be more engaged on Venezuela on a multilateral level. And the big challenge we face in Latin America today is that with the exception of Chile, I would say, we don't have a principled human rights, democracy-oriented foreign policy from countries in Latin America. And that is a very big problem. We need consistency, and we need governments to measure every problem in the region in terms of democracy and human rights with the same standards, and you don't have many governments who are willing to criticize Venezuela and El Salvador with the same bar. So that I think is very, very important. And just one thought on the role of the private sector, which clearly Rodrigo can talk more about. But I would think that a private sector needs legal certainty and clear rules of the game to be able to invest and make money. And for that, you need an independent judiciary, which is clearly lacking in Venezuela. So I would hope that that is a point in which different requirements converge, and people from different sectors in Venezuelan society are actually asking for an independent justice system. And this brings me to another final thought, which is, we've been talking about how to get to a conversation about a transition to democracy, and that is what we should be talking about now. But let's not forget the big mess that whoever gets power is going to inherit in terms of having to rebuild institutions, the rule of law, regain authority in parts of the country that are today being governed and ruled by illegal armed groups. So I think the challenges are immense, and we shouldn't forget about those.
I just want to ask a quick follow-up question on this, on the development agencies. I mean, there are a number of development agencies Chatham House did a report on the state of the electricity sector, and unfortunately, there's very little incentive, or there's over-compliance in questions of infrastructure, which arguably is a humanitarian, and certainly the U.S., now the U.S. changes do allow for investment in key areas like electricity, but there's an issue of over-compliance. Do you see any other role for development agencies without, obviously, understandably, the objective is always not to strengthen the hand or not allow a government to use outside funding for patronage or for clientelism, especially in the lead up to elections. But do you see any role that this could somehow be crafted positively?
Look, I think for many, many years, the UN played a shamefully silent role in Venezuela's crisis, and it took a lot of time for them to wake up and start really responding to what is happening in the country. But now we do see a stronger humanitarian response in terms of development in that sense, which has to be apolitical. I think those two conversations need to continue on parallel tracks, but you're also talking about these structural issues that go beyond providing humanitarian aid, and that is essential. You won't be able to rebuild the country without rebuilding the electricity grid, without allowing people to actually move from one part of the country to the other. But it's like a chicken and egg question, right? What do you do first? And I think that we can't lose sight of the big picture, which is we need a functional institutional government to be able to hold them accountable. Because then without that and without transparency, you're fueling the corruption that has characterized Venezuela for so many years.
Bibi.
Yes, well, for the prospect of the election, I think we have to be prepared for speak out about the persecution and political violence. This is something that we see in all the scenarios, and it's important for international community and everybody to speak out about violence and political persecution. And for the international envelope, I think it's important to understand that this not replace the humanitarian help that we need right now in the government. That should be put in place, the humanitarian. About the regional leaders, I think we need a multilateral action for peace, democracy, but also for justice. It's the time for the governments to compromise with human rights, and I think that the president of Chile is an example for that. Finally, about the impact of the sanctions, it's important to understand how it has been affecting population and also civil society, but always remain that the sanctions are not the reason of the crisis. And the reason of the crisis, as I said in the beginning of my presentation, is this model of authoritarian government. And that's why we need democracy, and the sanctions should be the tools to have this democracy in Venezuela.
I agree with you, obviously, but there was a report by the Woodrow Wilson Center written by Michael Penfold and Cindy Arntzen that calculated 30%, sanctions contributed to 30% increase in the cost of delivering humanitarian assistance. Thoughts on that? Is there a way of sort of, even within sanctions or liberalizing sanctions, how can you reduce the cost for humanitarian delivery of humanitarian assistance.
Yeah, it's important to think in that a mechanism to think how help the economics and the situation about sanctions. But at the same time, you have to think how to recover democracy in Venezuela. It's not something that you can talk in separate way. It's both things have to do because both things and both crises are getting damage to the population.
Rodrigo.
I want to jump into the conversation about development banks. Oh, I'm adding the banks word, the development organizations, because you approach the answer from the point of view of public sector recipients of those funds. But if we take the concept of development agencies and concentrate on development banks, like for example, IDB Invest or IFC from the World Bank, or we go to Europe and think about the FMO from Dutch, from the Netherlands, or the GKFW from Germany, or Proparco in France, you see these development banks that are financing private sectors throughout Latin America, even in Nicaragua, by the way, and Africa, and they are close to Venezuela. And those are funds that could go to certain industries, for example, in food production in Venezuela, where they can create thousands of food jobs, increase food production, which is good because our population needs calories, and start making a change from now. You don't have to be waiting to have other things to be changing. And that's a way that you can start benefiting Venezuelans, and as I mentioned before, benefiting the entire region. Those paths are right now close to Venezuela's private sector, unfortunately.
The one question was directed at you about what is the role of the private sector in sort of
very
democratization.
Our role is creating jobs, and everybody should be. This is very important. When you think about Venezuela's economy, please think of a train that has multiple cars, okay? But there's only one car that can pull all the rest. The locomotive is only one. It's the oil industry. All other industries are the rest of the cars. If the oil industry is not moving forward, it doesn't matter if you're in tourism, if you are in service or whatever, you are going to move very, very slow, if at all. So that's why is so important to find a solution for the oil situation.
It's funny, when I think of the Venezuelan economy, I think of a train, but a train wreck. Not necessarily the fault of the sanctions, but fundamentally bad economic policies. A couple more questions here. One from Elias Ferrer. How are economic sanctions leveraged against Maduro, or how can they be better leveraged against Maduro? To me, it seems, this is Elias, not me. To me, it seems they have hurt the economy and given him a cover for the humanitarian crisis. I'll have you respond to that. And then one from Anonymous. This anonymous guy is writing a lot of questions. It is already clear that the Maduro regime will not agree to conditions for free and fair elections. What can be done in this context? Is the United States ready to acknowledge that the 2022 negotiation approach failed? Are pro-democratization stakeholders moving forward with a different strategy? Tough questions. I'm going to go back to you, Rodrigo, first. Go ahead.
No, I think that's...
Oh, you can't do that. How are the economic sanctions, how can they be leveraged for Maduro? Can they? Come on, you can't punt. You're just passing. You're punting.
So what's your question again?
Question is, could economic sanctions be leveraged in some way to incentivize Maduro?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I really think that if you want to achieve political objectives, you have to give some more things in return. The economic sanctions are affecting us, the Venezuelans, not necessarily the political decision makers.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Actually, I did mean to put you on the spot, but thank you. Bibi.
Well, I think the Venezuelan situation cannot just focus on the sanctions. I think when was the conversation setting in Mexico and the open of the negotiation path was a negotiation that have all the topics that we have to talk about it, and we have to find a path for the crisis in Venezuela. Thinking one characteristic or dimension of the crisis cannot be enough to resolve the complexity of the crisis and in the long term. And that's why the efforts and that's what are doing Chatham House, I think, is so valuable, because we are thinking different actors on the society, national and international, looking for that response that are not easy, are difficult, are complex and involve many suffering of the people. But that's why we have to have the will to talk about it and to bring response. I think not just about the sanctions, it's about everything in Venezuela. It's about all the human rights are affected, all the economic production is affected, all the institution is affected. And that is not just one conversation, that is a complex conversation. And I think in the dialogue, the negotiation should be restored at the same time as the window of opportunity like elections in Venezuela. We have to track in different spaces to have this comprehensive and coherent solution to Venezuela.
Let me ask a follow-up question on that. Where should that conversation take place? Because it hasn't occurred so far. I mean, let's be honest, the sanctions policy, the maximum pressure, I mean, as I always teach my students at LSE in Colombia, any policy initiative has to have a working hypothesis. If we do this, this will work. And if that doesn't happen, you need to go back and revisit that hypothesis. And now, obviously, sanctions policies oftentimes, maximum pressure sanctions, whether it's Cuba or Venezuela, the thought is either people are going to rise up and overthrow the government, or there'll be defections within the government. That hasn't happened in Venezuela. So I agree with you. There needs to be a much more coherent, organic, multifaceted discussion. Where do you think and how that can take place?
There are so many conversations, and I think it's good to conversate, to talk about it, because something that Venezuela need is to talk, is sanar, heal, and to talk and recognize also the mistakes that everybody, and think together how to fix the crisis. And I think negotiation, Mexico was a good start, but they don't fulfill it to continue, and we have to pressure for that. But also, this space is a space of conversation that it needs to show the political will to fix Venezuela, to go forward to resolve the crisis, and that we don't see. And we need, in the same time, that conversation mixed with the elections, that is a right of participation, the right to look for democracy for Venezuela that is taking place. And it's a constitutional right. We have election, and we have to work for that. And in the same time, we have to have many conversations to heal, to fix the country, and to find agreements to restore us democracy in Venezuela.
Thank you.
I think, of course, economic sanctions can be leveraged with the Maduro government precisely because of your train explanation, because they are targeting the oil sector and they're targeting the ability of authorities to receive funds that they desperately need, and they limit their international legitimacy to do business and have access to certain markets. So they can clearly be used. I don't think it's contradictory with the second part of the question, which says that they have hurt the economy and that they have given Maduro an excuse to blame someone else for the humanitarian emergency for which they are only responsible. So I don't think those things they exclude one another. The question is, clearly there's an issue of overcompliance that has delayed humanitarian transactions, but we do need to put that in context, right? There's much more humanitarian aid reaching Venezuela now than ever before. Millions of dollars are arriving the country, but the humanitarian response is hugely underfunded as well, right? So a lot of different elements can fit into that same answer. The question is, are we thinking of sanctions as an end, as something that we just use to punish the Maduro government, or are they a tool to promote a different conversation? And that's where they can be leverage, and they can be important leverage. And in terms of the second question, it's clear that the Maduro regime will not agree to conditions, and what can be done in this context. I go back to what I said earlier. I think we need to think out of the box, beyond electoral conditions, and start really discussing and putting on the table accountability as a tool to generate those incentives to be able to have a conversation, which requires having someone on the other side who's willing to pass, is this something you say in English, pass to history? Become someone, pasar a la historia, to become someone who is willing to take that step and actually lead the conversation in another direction. And it's not gonna look clean, but we need that.
Yeah, certainly the idea is that this is for the long haul. I don't know whether Ambassador Murillo is teed up. Is he ready? Okay, so let me introduce, we'll move because we've been talking. No, he's not. Okay, I feel like I'm running a talk show here. We're going to break for a commercial now. Do you have a movie clip you want to show? So let me ask another round of questions then. Where is the forum where this can take place? I mean, I agree with you. There has to be some organic, multifaceted discussion that involves. Where do you think the forum can take place, Rodrigo? I mean, how do we begin this discussion that goes beyond the quick fix of hoping an election or regime collapse or whatever will change? How do we begin to? I mean, there's a number of people in this room right now that I wish should be up here as well. Of course, we only have so much time and such a large desk. Who also can express their opinions. I mean, Venezuela's, even among the opposition, I'm not saying this because as a concern or criticism of being divided, but it's a very plural society still. How do we begin this discussion?
Well, I think that foreign parties that are looking on how to improve policy towards Venezuela, I think they should review Robert McNamara's 11 lessons that he learned throughout his life in foreign affairs and policy here in DC. Because out of those 11 rules, there are a number of them that I think will be very useful. And I think it will take some humbleness and flexibility to adjust and to adjust the policy that was designed a few years ago. And most importantly, there's a lesson about getting into the shoes of the other party and try to understand how the other party feels, and you need to communicate with the other party. I think that there should be done more about that.
Thank you, Bibi.
I have three actors. I think the table and the conversation should congregate always is
Too much with the hands.
Yeah.
I'm the Italian on the board.
Yeah. Multi-actors, and I think it's a complex conversation that should be human rights and people on the center. Second, for the political, we need political will and articulation for democracy. And for the government, if we want to see real improvement and recognition, he has to fulfill the international recommendations of the international bodies. That recommendations are the way that they can show that there are improvements, there are fulfillment with the human rights, and start this restoration of the institutional path in Venezuela.
One last.
I'm ready. I stole my minutes before, so
Okay.
you go ahead.
That's fair. So now we're pleased to welcome remotely Ambassador Luis Gilberto Murillo, who's phoning in or participating virtually. He's the Ambassador of the United States of the Republic of Colombia. He was born in Chocó, Colombia. He holds a master's degree in mining engineering, a master's degree in engineering sciences, as an expert in public policy. Between 2016 and 2018, he served as the first Afro-Colombian Minister of Environment, Sustainable Development of Colombia. And during his tenure, he incrementally increased the protected areas of Colombia, brought ethnic communities to the center of the environmental agenda, and created the public policy framework for climate change mitigation adaptation. Ambassador Murillo, thank you very much for joining us. Please, take it away.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that very generous introduction. And I also would like to thank Diego Arenas and also Jason Marshak and Jeff Ramsey of the Atlantic Council for convening this event. Also to you, Chris, and Tamara Tarasiuk from the Inter-American Dialogue. This is a very important event. I listened to all the recommendations very carefully and very important for the international community. Let me recognize also the Ambassador Francisco Palmieri from the United States, and someone who have been very involved in solutions for Venezuela, and also a great partner working for strengthening and deepening the relationship between states. Let me say that this event has been very important, and I'm sure for all participants that have taken part in this discussion on solutions for Venezuela. The first week of President Gustavo Petro administration marked a new stage of the relation between Colombia and Venezuela. Diplomatic relations were immediately reestablished, and ambassadors were appointed by both governments. In November 2022, a state visit by President Gustavo Petro to Caracas took place, in which the path towards normalization of bilateral relations was made official. And the fundamental issues of that bilateral agenda were raised and discussed, particularly energy integration, development, strengthening and protecting human rights, and cooperation on matters of peace and security. President Petro and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Álvaro Leiva, have visited Venezuela and visited with President Maduro in Caracas on several occasions. During these meetings, the agenda included specific topics regarding bilateral issues, but also aspects related to the total peace policy that Colombian government and Venezuela as guarantor of the peace process with the ELA, and also related to Venezuelan political situation. This is a key milestone in the process of building mutual trust after several years-long diplomatic relations between the two countries.
Ambassador Murillo, wait 1 second. You're, for some reason, the connection's a little weak. Do you want to just pause it and then? Let's try again. Okay. Okay, let's try again, Ambassador. Let's see.
I see that you have something that by the team. The channel communication have been established.
Could you change, maybe, Ambassador, could you change perhaps the position of the microphone or move yourself a little closer? It's becoming a little garbled. You there? Now he just froze. Did he freeze?
Yes.
Uh-oh. There has to be the connection. So, thwarted by technology. Wait. Well, unfortunately, I'm sorry, Ambassador Murillo. I think I speak for everyone here, but we're very much looking forward to hearing what you had to say. Unfortunately, we can't understand it. Not your fault, but it's garbled. I don't know, what we propose. We'll just continue on, and then if you want to try again in a second, no, I'm being told it's not going to work. So again, I feel again like I'm at a talk show that's suddenly run afoul. Well, thank you very much for joining. We have some time. As I mentioned, there are a number of Venezuelans here that represent the diversity of Venezuelan opinions. For those of you who don't know them, I really invite you now, taking advantage of the time here, to get to know them and circulate. Everyone from Jesus Seguais, who works with Venezuelans and migrants or refugees in shelters in New York and also in Colombia. Roberto Patiño, who works on humanitarian assistance. So please take a chance and take an opportunity here to please circulate and network, something Washingtonians do very well. So I invite you to do that here. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Ambassador, I'm very, very sorry. There's no accounting for technology. I think I curse all technology that I touch, so it's probably my fault. Thank you very much, everyone.